Most people accept the night shift because it feels predictable. The building is quiet, the routine is familiar, and there are fewer interruptions than during the day. After a while, you begin to trust the silence around you. You convince yourself that being alone makes the job easier. What you don't expect is how quickly that silence can start to feel occupied. Working the night shift changes the way a place feels. During the day, buildings feel normal because there are people everywhere. Noise fills the space. Movement makes everything seem grounded. At night, that disappears. You start to hear things you never noticed before. A door shifting slightly. A sound from a hallway that should be empty. A movement caught in the corner of your eye that doesn't repeat when you look directly at it. When you work alone long enough, you learn what belongs there and what doesn't. And that's what makes it disturbing when something feels present, even though no one else is supposed to be in the building. The people in these stories weren't expecting anything unusual. They were just trying to finish their shift and make it to morning. If you're listening right now, make sure you're subscribed and tell me in the comments if you've ever worked alone at night. Let's begin. I worked as a night security guard at a small 2-story medical office building on the edge of town. It wasn't a hospital, just a quiet complex with private clinics that operated during the day. After 10 p.m., the entire building was empty except for me. My shift ran from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, and most of the time, nothing unusual ever happened. The job was repetitive in a way that made the hours pass slowly. Every hour, I walked both floors, checked that all the suite doors were locked, tested the stairwell exits, and then returned to the small security office near the lobby to monitor the cameras. There were 12 cameras in total, covering the hallways, stairwells, lobby, and parking lot. After a few weeks, I had memorized the building's patterns. I knew which light in the upstairs corridor flickered slightly. I knew the vending machine on the first floor made a low mechanical hum before resetting. I knew exactly how the air conditioning sounded when it kicked on. When you spend enough nights alone in the same place, you stop feeling like a guard and start feeling like part of the building. The first thing that felt wrong happened a little before 3 a.m. I was watching the upstairs hallway camera when I noticed what looked like a darker shape passing slowly across the far wall near one of the closed clinics. It wasn't clear enough to look like a person, but it was darker than the surrounding shadows and moved in a way that caught my attention. I assumed it was a lighting fluctuation. That hallway had one fixture that dimmed occasionally, so I rewound the footage to double-check. The hallway looked completely empty. I told myself it was just compression or a shadow from outside. No doors had opened. No alarms had triggered. Still, something about the movement didn't match the way light normally behaved in that space. About 20 minutes later, I did my routine walk upstairs. The hallway looked exactly as it always did. Clean floors, closed doors, steady lighting. But as I walked past Suite 204, I felt a sudden drop in temperature that didn't match the rest of the building. It wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable enough that I stopped walking. The air felt heavier, almost dense, like the space was holding something. I checked the door handle. Locked. I listened carefully for any sound inside the suite, but it was completely silent. I finished the round and returned downstairs, telling myself that being alone for hours can make small things feel bigger than they are. Around 4 a.m., something happened that was harder to dismiss. I was watching the lobby camera when I noticed one of the waiting room chairs near the back wall slowly shift backward. It didn't jerk or tip. It slid smoothly and deliberately, a few inches away from the row it had been aligned with. There was no one in the frame, no shadow connected to it, no sign of vibration. I immediately rewound the footage. The chair remained still for several minutes, and then, without any visible cause, it moved. I stared at the screen, trying to think of a reasonable explanation. Maybe the floor was uneven. Maybe I hadn't noticed that it was already slightly out of place. But I had walked through that lobby less than an hour earlier, and those chairs were heavy with metal legs that scraped loudly against the tile when moved. This time, I forced myself to go look in person. The lobby felt different when I stepped into it. The lights were the same brightness, but the silence felt thicker. The chair was exactly where I had seen it on camera, slightly pulled back from the others, as if someone had just stood up from it. As I stood there, I became aware of something else. The faint sound of footsteps from the second floor. They were slow and measured, like someone walking casually down the hallway. I could hear the subtle echo through the ceiling. I knew every mechanical sound in that building, and this wasn't pipes or ventilation. It had rhythm, weight, intention. I looked toward the stairwell, expecting to see someone descending. No one did. The footsteps continued for several seconds, then stopped abruptly, as if whoever had been walking realized they were being listened to. I went back to the security office and checked every upstairs camera at once. All hallways were empty. No doors open. No movement. For the rest of the shift, I stayed in that office with the monitors pulled closer than usual. Nothing else moved. Nothing appeared on camera again. But the building no longer felt neutral. It felt aware. I didn't report what happened. There was no proof beyond what I had already seen, and even that felt impossible to explain. A week later, I requested a transfer to a different location. I had spent weeks learning the normal behavior of that building. I knew its sounds, its lighting, its rhythm. And sometime around 3 a.m. that night, something unfamiliar had started moving inside it. It's not just the shadow or the chair moving that makes this story disturbing. It's the fact that he knew that building so well. When you work somewhere every night, you recognize every normal sound and every normal detail. So when something changes, even slightly, you feel it immediately. The footsteps are what stand out to me. Cameras can fail. Lighting can glitch. But hearing slow, deliberate steps in a building that should be completely empty is harder to explain. Let me know what you think this was. Faulty equipment, or something that only shows up when you're alone at night. I worked alone on the overnight shift at a 24-hour gas station, just off a quiet highway exit. Between midnight and 5 in the morning, the traffic was almost non-existent. Most nights, I would see 1 or 2 cars an hour at most, usually long-distance drivers stopping for fuel or coffee. The building had large glass windows wrapping around the front, which meant I could see the entire parking lot from behind the counter. That visibility usually made me feel safe. There were bright overhead lights above the pumps, security cameras in every corner, and nothing but open road and a thin tree line surrounding the property. Over time, I became familiar with the store's rhythm. The refrigerators along the back wall produced a steady mechanical hum. The ice machine made a cracking sound when it reset. The automatic front doors would sometimes slide open slightly if the pressure shifted outside, but they never fully opened unless someone approached. When you work in a place like that every night, you develop a strong sense of what belongs and what doesn't. One night, a little after 3 a.m., a dark-colored sedan pulled into the far edge of the parking lot near the tree line instead of stopping at a pump. It parked in a section where the light didn't fully reach, leaving most of the vehicle in shadow. The engine shut off, and the headlights remained on for several seconds before turning off as well. I expected someone to step out, but no door opened. I kept watching, assuming the driver was checking their phone or gathering something before coming inside. Several minutes passed, and the car didn't move. The windows were too dark to see through clearly, but I had the growing sensation that whoever was inside was aware of me. It wasn't a logical thought, just a feeling that I was being observed from a distance. I stepped outside briefly, under the pretense of adjusting a trash bin near the entrance, so I could get a clearer look. From that angle, I could see the outline of the driver's seat, but no movement. The stillness of the vehicle felt deliberate, almost patient. When I went back inside and locked the front door temporarily, something about the situation felt wrong. I watched the car for another minute, and then, without ever seeing it start or move, the space near the tree line was suddenly empty. There is only one entrance and exit to that lot, directly in front of the store. I would have seen headlights sweep across the pavement. I would have heard the engine, but there was nothing. The car was simply gone. I stood there trying to rationalize it, telling myself I must have looked away at the wrong moment. Maybe I had been distracted by the register or glanced down at my phone. That explanation made sense in theory, but it didn't feel convincing. About 10 minutes later, I heard the restroom door at the back of the store slowly open. The hinge made a long, soft creaking sound that echoed down the short hallway. My body reacted before my mind did. The sensor above the front door hadn't chimed, which meant no one had entered. I walked cautiously toward the back, noticing that the restroom light was on. I distinctly remembered turning it off during my cleaning round earlier that night. I called out, asking if someone was inside, and waited for a response. The store felt unusually quiet in that moment, as if even the refrigerators had softened. When I pushed the restroom door open fully, the room was empty, the sink was dry, the trash can undisturbed, but the air felt warmer than the rest of the store, thick enough that I became aware of my breathing. As I stepped back into the main area, the automatic front doors began sliding open. They moved smoothly and completely, as if someone had walked directly up to them. I looked toward the entrance immediately. No one was there. The parking lot was empty under the overhead lights. The night air outside looked completely still. After a brief pause, the doors closed again on their own. I returned to the counter, unsettled, but still searching for a reasonable explanation. That was when I noticed something standing near the tree line where the car had originally been parked. At first, I assumed it was a trick of the shadows, but the shape remained fixed. It was tall and narrow, darker than the surrounding darkness, positioned just beyond the reach of the parking lot lights. It did not shift or sway. It simply existed there, as if it had always been part of the landscape. As I focused on it, I realized there was something unnatural about its posture. The proportions seemed slightly off, the outline too rigid. I reached for the phone to call the police, but before I could dial, the store lights flickered strongly enough to dim the entire interior for a split second. When the lights stabilized, the figure was no longer at the tree line. It was closer to the building, now standing near the edge of the concrete, just beyond the first row of pumps. There had been no visible movement between those positions. My heart started pounding in a way that made it difficult to think clearly. The automatic doors slid open again, this time remaining open. Cold air drifted into the store, carrying with it a sense of pressure that felt almost physical. I could not see anyone crossing the threshold, but the atmosphere inside shifted immediately. The temperature dropped, and the hum of the refrigerators seemed to grow louder, as if straining against something. Then I heard footsteps moving slowly across the tile floor from the direction of the entrance. They were measured and deliberate, each one distinct. I could see the reflection of the doorway in the glass behind the counter, but there was no visible body casting those steps. The sound continued until it reached the space directly in front of me, close enough that if someone had been standing there physically, I would have been able to see them clearly. The air felt dense, almost vibrating, and I became aware of a faint smell, something metallic and unfamiliar. I stood frozen behind the counter, unable to move or speak. After several long seconds, the automatic doors slowly closed on their own. The pressure in the room lifted gradually, like a storm moving away. The humming of the machines returned to normal, and the temperature stabilized. When morning came, the parking lot showed no signs of disturbance. No tire tracks near the tree line. No footprints on the concrete. I checked the security footage later with my manager, but at the exact moment when the lights flickered and the figure seemed to move, the camera feed had briefly glitched. There was no clear image of anything in the lot. I never worked another overnight shift after that week. I can accept that the car might have left when I wasn't looking. I can accept that doors sometimes malfunction. What I can't explain are the footsteps that stopped directly in front of me, in a store that should have been completely empty. What makes the story unsettling isn't just the figure near the tree line. It's the sequence of events. The car that disappears without being seen leaving. The restroom light turning on by itself. The automatic doors opening when no one is there. And then the footsteps that move across the floor with clear direction and weight. Individually, you could explain each detail. Equipment fails. Cameras glitch. Doors malfunction. But when everything happens in a connected progression, it becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence. Do you think someone was physically there the entire time? Or was that presence something that didn't need to be seen to be real? I worked the night shift as a nurse in a long-term care facility that had been operating since the late 1970s. Although parts of the building had been renovated over the years, one entire wing still looked almost exactly as it had decades ago, with slightly dimmer lighting, narrower hallways, and older equipment that maintenance insisted was still reliable. During overnight hours, staffing was minimal, and most residents were asleep, leaving long stretches of silence, broken only by the low hum of medical devices and the occasional distant cough. I had grown used to that rhythm, and after several months on nights, I could tell the difference between normal mechanical sounds and anything out of place. One hallway in the older wing always felt subtly uncomfortable to walk through. It wasn't dramatic or obviously frightening, but the air felt heavier there, and sound seemed to travel differently, almost muffled. Around 2:30 a.m. one morning, while I was finishing chart updates at the nurse's station, the call system chimed, and the board lit up to indicate a request from room 217 at the very end of that hallway. I stared at the number longer than I should have, because room 217 was currently unoccupied. The previous patient had passed away 3 days earlier, and the room had been cleaned, but not yet reassigned. I knew that because I had handled part of the discharge documentation myself. Assuming it was a wiring glitch, I walked down the hallway toward the room, noticing how my footsteps echoed slightly against the polished floor. The door to 217 was not fully closed as I had last seen it. It was open just a few inches. I pushed it open and turned on the light, revealing a perfectly orderly space with a neatly made bed, empty bedside table, and the call light cord resting exactly where housekeeping had placed it. The wall panel showed no active call signal. Everything looked undisturbed. I stood there briefly, feeling faintly embarrassed at how tense I was over what was likely an electrical issue, then turned off the light and closed the door firmly before returning to the station. When I checked the board again, the call alert had disappeared. Nearly 40 minutes later, as I was reviewing medication logs, I heard a sound that made my hands pause over the keyboard. It was the unmistakable motorized adjustment of a hospital bed, a low mechanical whir, followed by the subtle shift of metal and mattress. The sound came from the direction of the older wing, and there was no doubt in my mind about which room it was coming from. I walked back down the hallway more quickly this time, acutely aware of how quiet the rest of the building felt. The door to room 217 was now open wider than before, though I was certain I had pulled it closed. The room was dark again. When I turned on the light, I immediately saw that the bed was no longer flat. The upper portion had been raised into a seated position, angled as if someone were propped up against invisible pillows. The call light cord that had been neatly placed earlier now hung partially over the side of the mattress, swaying slightly. I remained standing in the doorway, trying to process what I was seeing. These beds required continuous pressure on a control panel to adjust. They did not activate on their own, and they certainly did not move in complete silence except for the motor itself. As I stared at the bed, the center of the mattress slowly compressed, forming a clear indentation consistent with the weight of someone sitting upright. There was no visible body, no shadow outlining a shape, but the depression in the mattress was distinct and deep enough to make my throat tighten. The air in the room felt noticeably denser, and I experienced a subtle pressure in my ears, like a shift in altitude. I could not see anything occupying that space, yet every instinct told me that something was there. Without any visible trigger, the bed began lowering back down, the motor running steadily until the mattress returned to its original flat position. The indentation gradually smoothed out, and the call-light cord slid back onto the center of the bed as if gently placed there. I stepped backward into the hallway without turning away from the room and pulled the door closed again, this time making sure it latched. When I reached the nurse's station, the call board showed no activity, and the rest of the facility remained undisturbed. Maintenance inspected the wiring and the bed controls the following morning and found no faults. Room 217 stayed empty for weeks afterward. Even now, I cannot explain how a bed that requires deliberate physical input adjusted itself twice in one night, nor how a mattress formed the unmistakable impression of a seated patient in a room that was supposed to be vacant. What makes this account especially disturbing is the physical interaction. A call light can malfunction, wiring can fail, but a hospital bed requires sustained pressure on a control panel to move, and the indentation in the mattress suggests weight, not just mechanical error. That detail changes everything. There is also the timing. The room had recently belonged to someone who passed away, and the activity began only days later. Whether that connection is meaningful or coincidence depends on what you believe. Do you think this was a technical anomaly that just happened to look intentional, or something that returned to a place it once occupied? One rented that house because of the silence. It sat alone at the edge of a rural road, surrounded by open fields and scattered trees that swayed heavily when the wind picked up at night. There were no streetlights, no nearby houses within sight, and after sunset, the darkness became almost complete, except for the weak porch light above the front door. The house itself was old, but structurally solid, with wooden floors that creaked in predictable spots and pipes that clicked softly when the temperature dropped. Within a week of living there, I had memorized every normal sound it could produce, which is why what started happening stood out so clearly. The first time I heard it, I woke up suddenly at exactly 2:07 a.m. to 3 firm knocks on the front door. They were not frantic or aggressive, just deliberate and evenly spaced, like someone standing politely on the other side, waiting to be acknowledged. I stayed still in bed, listening for footsteps on the gravel driveway or the sound of a vehicle engine fading in the distance. But there was nothing. The night outside was completely still. After several minutes, I convinced myself it could have been part of a dream, blending with the natural settling noises of the house. The following night, the same thing happened. I woke again at 2:07 a.m. to the exact same 3 knocks, identical in rhythm and intensity. This time I got out of bed and walked down the hallway toward the living room, feeling the cool wood beneath my feet. I turned on the porch light and looked through the narrow window beside the door. The yard was empty, the dirt road undisturbed, and the fields beyond remained motionless under the dark sky. I opened the door quickly, expecting at least to catch the sound of someone walking away, but the only thing waiting outside was cold air and silence. On the 3rd night, I decided to stay awake. I turned off the interior lights and sat on the couch facing the door, watching the time on my phone. When the screen shifted from 2:06 to 2:07, the knocks came again, 3 steady impacts that resonated through the wood and into the floor beneath me. I felt them as much as I heard them. I stood up immediately and moved closer to the door, stopping just short of touching it. The knocking ceased, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard footsteps on the porch. They were slow and deliberate, heavy enough to make the old boards creak in a sequence that suggested real weight shifting from step to step. The sound moved from directly in front of the door toward the living room window. I turned my head toward the glass, seeing only my own faint reflection and the darkness beyond it. There was no silhouette, no shadow crossing the porch, yet the creaking continued clearly, tracking movement that circled back toward the door. As I stared at the handle, it began to turn slowly. It did not shake or rattle, as if someone were trying to force it open. It rotated with controlled pressure until it met the resistance of the lock. I knew I had locked it earlier that night. The handle paused at its limit before easing back into place, and for a few seconds, the porch was silent again. Then the 3 knocks returned, louder this time, vibrating through the door with a firmness that felt almost intentional. I stepped backward without taking my eyes off the entrance, a strong instinct telling me not to open it. The knocking stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before, as though something were waiting for a response that I refused to give. I remained standing in the living room, listening carefully, and that was when I heard a new sound that made my stomach drop. It came from inside the house. The wooden floor in the hallway began to creak in the same measured pattern I had just heard on the porch. The sound moved slowly down the corridor toward my bedroom, each familiar board responding as if someone were walking across it. I was not moving. I could see the empty hallway from where I stood, yet the creaks continued with unmistakable rhythm and direction. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door. 3 knocks followed, softer than the ones at the front entrance, but identical in spacing. I felt the blood drain from my face as the bedroom doorknob began to turn with the same calm, steady motion as before. It met the resistance of the lock and pressed slightly before returning to its original position. There were no retreating footsteps, no sound of the front door opening or closing, no indication of anything leaving the house. The silence simply returned as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I checked the dirt around the porch for footprints, but the ground was undisturbed. I installed a security camera facing the entrance later that week, and during the remainder of my time there, it never recorded a single visitor at 2:00. At 2:07 a.m., whatever knocked, walked across my porch, and crossed my hallway never appeared on camera, and it never needed the door to be unlocked to reach the inside of the house. What makes this story especially disturbing is the transition from outside to inside. An unexplained knock can still be rationalized. Even a turning doorknob could be blamed on pressure, temperature changes, or mechanical issues. But footsteps moving through a hallway, following the exact pattern of the floorboards, and stopping at a locked bedroom door suggests something far more deliberate. There is also the precision of the timing. The activity occurred at the same minute each night, with the same rhythm, the same controlled pressure, and the same sequence of events. That consistency feels intentional rather than random. If nothing ever appeared on camera and no physical trace was left behind, then whatever was knocking did not need a physical body to move through the house. The real question is not who was outside the door, but what was already inside. 4 different night shifts, 4 different locations. A hospital corridor that should have been empty. A workplace where something repeated the same movement with intention. A presence that grew more aggressive the longer it was ignored. And a house where whatever knocked did not need the door to open to get inside. Different settings, same pattern. Isolation, routine, and something that seemed to understand exactly when you were most vulnerable. Night work changes your perception, but these stories were not just about exhaustion or imagination. They were about consistency, timing, and behavior that felt aware. That is what makes them linger long after the shift ends. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If you enjoy true night shift horror stories and want more content like this every week, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next upload. Leave a like if this video unsettled you, and share your own experience in the comments. I read them carefully. On the end screen right now, you will see 2 more videos selected for you. Choose one and keep the night going.